raise their profit by price discriminating. Airline prices. Seats on airplanes are sold at many different prices. Most airlines charge a lower price for a round trip ticket between two cities. If the traveler stays over a Saturday night. At first, this seems odd. Why should it matter to the airline whether a passenger stays over a Saturday night? The reason is that this rule provides a way to separate business travelers and leisure travelers. A passenger on a business trip has a high willingness to pay and most likely does not want to stay over Saturday night. By contrast, a passenger traveling for personal reasons has a lower willingness to pay and is more likely to be willing to stay over a Saturday night. Thus, the airlines can successfully price discriminate by charging a lower price for passengers who stay over a Saturday night. Discount coupons. Many companies offer discount coupons to the public in newspaper, magazines, or online. A buyer simply has to clip the coupon to get $0.50 off her next purchase. Why do companies offer these coupons? Why don't they just cut the price of the product by $0.50? The answer is that coupons allow companies to price discriminate. Companies know that not all customers are willing to spend time clipping coupons. Moreover, the willingness to clip coupon is related to the customer's willingness to pay for the good. A rich and busy executive is unlikely to spend the time clipping discount coupons out of the newspaper, and she is probably willing to pay a higher price for many goods. A person who is unemployed is more likely to clip coupon and to have a lower willingness to pay. Thus, by charging a lower price only to those customers who clip coupons, firm can successfully price discriminate. Financial aid. Many colleges and universities give financial aid to needy students. One can view this policy as a type of price discrimination. Wealthy students have greater financial resources and therefore a higher willingness to pay than needy students. By charging higher tuition and selectively offering financial aid, school is effect charge prices to customers based on the value they place on the going to that school. This behavior is similar to that of any price discriminating monopolist. Quantity discounts. So far, in our examples of price discrimination, the monopolists charge different prices to different customers. Sometimes, however, monopolists price discriminate by charging different prices to the same customers for different units that the customers buys. For example, many firms offer lower prices to customers who buy large quantities. A bakery might charge $0.50 for each donut but $5 for a dozen. This is a form of price discrimination because the customer pays a higher price for the first unit she buys than for the 12th. Quantity discounts are often a successful way of price discriminating because a customer's willingness to pay for an additional unit declines as she buys more units. Quick quiz. Give two examples of price discrimination. Explain how perfect price discrimination affects consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total. In the news, price discrimination is in higher education. Colleges and universities are increasingly charging different prices to make different students, which make data on the cost of education harder to interpret. Misconceptions 101. Why college costs aren't soaring? By Ivan Soltas. Conventional wisdom suggests that US colleges and universities have become sharply more expensive in recent years. When kids do graduate, the most daunting challenge can be the cost of college. President Barack Obama said in his 2012 State of the Union address, "We can't just keep subsidizing skyrocketing tuition. We'll run out of money." At first, the view that the cost of college is rising appeared to have data on its side. Published tuition prices and fees at college have risen 3 times faster than the rate of consumer price index inflation since 1978. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, real tuition and fees have increased, to be sure, but hardly as significantly as the media offer report or the data suggest. At face value, the inflation adjusted net price of college has risen only modestly over the last 2 decades. According to data from the College Board's annual survey of colleges, what has happened is a shift towards price discrimination, offering multiple prices for the same product. Universities have offset this increase in sticker price for most families through an expansion of grant based financial aid and scholarships that has caused the BLS measure to rise without increasing the net cost. Wealthier families now pay more than ever to send their children to college. But for much of the middle class, the real net cost of college has not changed significantly. For of the poor, the expansion of aid has increased the accessibility and affordability of college education. The nation's most selective institutions are leading the trend toward income based price discrimination. For example, at Harvard University, the measure of students receive financial aid. In 2012, 1 year of undergraduate education had a sticker price of $54,496 and came with an average grant of roughly $41,000. In other words, the cost burden of college has become significantly more progressive since the 1990s. Students from wealthier families not only now pay more for their own education but also have come to heavily subsidize the cost of the less fortunate. Source Bloomberg.com, November 27, 2012. Public policy towards monopolies. We have seen that monopolies, in contrast to competitive markets, fail to allocate resources efficiently. Monopolies produce less than the socially desirable quantity of output and charge prices above the marginal cost. Policymakers in the government can respond to the problem of monopoly in one of four ways: by trying to make monopolized or industries more competitive, by regulating the behavior of the monopolies, by turning some private monopolies into public enterprises, by doing nothing at all, increasing competitions with antitrust laws. If Coca-Cola and PepsiCo wanted to merge, the deal would be closely examined by the federal government before it went into effect. The lawyers and economists in the Department of Justice might well decide that a merger between these two large soft drink companies would make the US soft drink market substantially less competitive and as a result would reduce the economic well-being of the country as a whole. If so, the Department of Justice would challenge the merger in court, and if the judge agreed, the two companies would not be allowed to merge. It is precisely the kind of challenge that prevented software giant Microsoft from buying Intuit in 1994. Similarly, in 2011, the government blocked the phone giant AT&T from buying its competitor T-Mobile. The government derives this power over private industry from antitrust laws, a collection of statutes aimed at curbing monopoly power. The first and most important of these laws was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which Congress passed in 1890 to reduce the market power of the large and powerful trusts that were viewed are dominating the economy at the time. The Clayton Antitrust Act, passed in 1914, strengthened the government's powers and authorized private lawsuits. As the US Supreme Court once put it, the antitrust laws are a comprehensive charter of economic liberty aimed at preserving free and unfettered competition as the rule of trade. The antitrust laws give the government various ways to promote competition. They allow the government to prevent mergers such as the merger between AT&T and T-Mobile. At times, they allow the government to break up a large company into a group of smaller ones. Finally, the antitrust laws prevent companies from coordinating their activities in ways that make market less competitive. Antitrust laws have cost as well as benefits. Sometimes companies merge not to reduce competition but to lower cost through more efficient joint production. These benefits from mergers are sometimes called synergies. For example, many US banks have merged in recent years and by combining operations have been able to reduce administrative staff. The airline industry has experienced a similar consolidation If antitrust laws are to raise social welfare, the government must be able to determine which mergers are desirable and which are not. That is, it must be able to measure and compare the social benefit from synergies with the social cost of reduced competitions. Critics of the antitrust laws are skeptical that government can perform the necessary cost benefit analysis with sufficient accuracy. In the end the application of antitrust laws is often controversial even among the experts. Regulation. Another way to government deal with the problem of monopoly is by regulating the behavior of monopolists. This solution is common in the case of natural monopolies, such as water and electric companies. These companies are not allowed to have to charge any price they want. Instead, government agencies regulate their prices. What price should the government set for a natural monopoly? This question is not as easy as it might at first appear. One might conclude that the price should equal the monopolist marginal cost. If price equals marginal cost, customers will buy the quantity of the monopolist output that maximizes total surplus, and the allocation of resources will be efficient. There are, however, two practical problems with marginal cost pricing as a regulatory system. The first arises from the logic of cost curves. By definition, natural monopolies have declining average total cost, as we first discussed in chapter 13. When average total cost is declining, marginal cost is less than average total cost. This situation is illustrated in figure 10, which shows a firm with a large fixed cost and then constant marginal cost thereafter. If regulators were to set price equal to marginal cost, that price would be less than the firm's average total cost and the firm would lose money. Instead of charging such a low price, the monopoly firm would just exit the industry. Regulators can respond to this problem in various ways, none of which is perfect. One way is to subsidize the monopolist. In essence, the government picks up the losses inherent in marginal cost pricing. Yet to pay for the subsidy, the government need to raise money through taxation, which involves its own dead weight losses. Alternative, the regulators can allow the monopolist to charge a price higher than marginal cost. If the regulated price equals average total cost, the monopolist earn exactly zero economic profit. Yet average cost pricing lead to dead weight losses because the monopolist price no longer reflects the marginal cost of producing the good. In essence, average cost pricing is like a tax on the good the monopolist is selling. The second problem with marginal cost pricing as a regulatory system, and with average cost pricing as well, is that it gives the monopolist no incentive to reduce costs. Each firm in competitive market tries to reduce its cost because lower cost means higher profit. But if a regulated monopolist knows that regulators will reduce prices whenever cost falls, the monopolist will not benefit from lower cost. In practice, regulators deal with this problem by allowing monopoly to keep some of the benefits from lower cost in the form of higher profit, a practice that requires some departure from marginal cost pricing. Public ownership. The third policy used by the government to deal with monopoly is public ownership. That is, rather than regulating a natural monopoly that is run by a private firm, the government can run the monopoly itself. This solution is common in many Europe countries where the government owns and operates utilizes such as telephone, water, electric companies. In the United States, the government runs the postal service. The delivery of ordinary first class mail is often thought to be natural monopoly. Economists usually prefer private to public ownership of natural monopolies. The key issue is how the ownership of the firm affects the cost of production. Private ownership have an incentive to minimize cost as long as they reap part of the benefit in the form of higher profit. If the firm's managers are doing a bad job of keeping costs down, the firm's owners will fire them. By contrast, if the government bureaucrats who run a monopoly do a bad job, the losers are the customers and taxpayers, whose only recourse is political system. The bureaucrats may become a special interest group and attempt to block cost reducing reforms. But uh, cost reducing reforms. Put simply, as a way of ensuring that firms are well run, the voting booth is less reliable than the profit motive. Doing nothing. Each of the foregoing policies aimed at reducing the problem of monopoly has drawbacks. As a result, some economists argue that it is often best of the government not to try to remedy the inefficiencies of monopoly pricing. Here is the assessment of economist George Stigler, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in industrial organization. A famous theorem in economics states that a competitive enterprise economy will produce the largest possible income from a given stock of resources. No real income meets the exact condition of the theorem, and all real income will fall short of the ideal economy, a different called market failure. In my view, however, the degree of market failure for American economy is much smaller than the political failure arising from imperfections of economic policies found in real political system. As this quotation makes clear, determining the proper role of the government in the country in the economy requires judgment about politics as well as economics. Quick quiz. Describe the ways policymakers can respond to the inefficiencies caused by monopolies. List a potential problem with each of these policies response. Conclusion. The prevalence of monopolies. This chapter has discussed the behavior of firms that have control over the prices they charge. We have seen that these firms behave very differently from the competitive firms studied in the previous chapter. Table 2 summarizes some of the key similarities and differences between competitive and monopoly markets. From the standpoint of public policy, a crucial result is that a monopoly produces less than socially efficient quantity and charges a price above marginal cost. As a result, a monopoly causes deadweight losses. In some cases, these inefficiencies can be mitigated through price discrimination by the monopolist, but other times they call for policymakers to take an active role. How prevalent are the problem of monopoly? There are two answers to this question. In one sense, monopolies are common. Most firms have some control over the prices they charge. They are not forced to charge the market price for their goods because their goods are not exactly the same as those offered by other firms. A Ford Taurus is not the same as Toyota Camry. Ben and Jerry's ice cream is not the same as Breyer's. Each of these goods has downward sloping demand curve, which gives each producer some degree of monopoly power. Yet firms with substantial monopoly power are rare. Few goods are truly unique. Most have substitutes that, even if not exactly the same, are similar. Ben and Jerry can raise the price of their ice cream a little without losing all their sales, but if they raise it a lot, sales will fall substantially as their customers switch to other brands. In the end, monopoly power is matter of degree. It is true that many firms have some monopoly power. It is also true that their monopoly power is usually limited. In such a situation, we will not go for wrong assuming that firms operate in competitive markets, even if that is not precisely the case.
Today we will be beginning with the chapter number 7, consumers, producers and the efficiency of markets. When consumers go to grocery stores to buy food for Thanksgiving dinner, they may be disappointed to see the high prices of turkey. At the same time, when farmers bring to market the turkeys that they have raised, they probably wish that the price of turkey were even higher. These views are not surprising. Buyers always want to pay less, and sellers always want to be paid more. But is there a right price for turkey from the standpoint point of a society as a whole? In previous chapters, we saw how in market economics the forces of supply and demand determine the prices of goods and services and the quantities sold. Now we are on page number 134 of the book. So far, however, we have described the way markets allocate scarce resources without directly addressing the question of whether these market allocations are desirable. In other words, our analysis has been positive, what is rather not rather than normative. We know that the price of turkey adjusts to ensure that the quantity of turkey supplied equals the quantity of turkey demanded, but at this equilibrium, is the quantity of turkey produced and consumed too small, too large, or just right? In this chapter we take up the topic of welfare economics, the study of how the allocation of resources affects economic well-being. We begin by examining the benefits that buyers and sellers receive from engaging in market transactions. We then examine how society can make these benefits as large as possible. This analysis leads to the profound conclusion in many market. The equilibrium of supply and demand maximizes the total benefits received by all buyers and sellers combined. As you all may recall from chapter number 1, one of the 10 principles of economics is that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. The study of welfare economics explains this principle more fully. It also answers our question about the right price of turkey. The price that balances the supply and demand for turkey is, in a particular sense, the best one because it maximizes the total welfare of turkey consumers and turkey producers. No consumer or producer of turkeys aims to achieve this goal, but their joint action directed by market prices moves them toward a welfare maximizing outcome, as if led by an invisible hand. Now, consumer surplus. We begin our study of welfare economics by looking at the benefits of buyers receiving from participating in a market. Now, willingness to pay. Imagine that you own a mint condition recording of Elvis Presley's first album. Because you are not an Elvis Presley fan, you decide to sell it. One way to do so is to hold an auction. Four Elvis fans show up for your auction: Taylor, Carrie, Rihanna, and Gaga. They would all like to own the album, but each of them has a limit on the amount she is willing to pay for it. Table 1 shows the maximum price that each of the four possible buyers would pay. A buyer's maximum is called her willingness to pay, and it measures how much that buyer values the good. Each buyer would be eager to buy the album at a price less than her willingness to pay, and she would refuse to buy the album at a price greater than her willingness to pay. Now, at a price equal to her willingness to pay, the buyer would be indifferent about buying the good. If the price is exactly the same as the value she places on the album, she would equally be happy buying it or keeping her money. We are on page number 135 now. Okay, now to sell your album, you begin the bidding process at a low price, say $10, because all four buyers are willing to pay much more. The price rises quickly. The bidding stops when Taylor bids $80 or slightly more. At this point, Carrie, Rihanna, and Gaga have all dropped out the bidding because they are unwilling to bid any more than $80. Taylor pays you $80 and gets the album. Note that the album has gone to the buyer who values it most highly. Now, what benefit does Taylor receive from buying the Elvis Presley album? In a sense, Taylor has found a real bargain. She is willing to pay $100 for the album but pays only $80. We say that Taylor receives consumer surplus of $20. Consumer surplus is the amount a buyer is willing to pay for a good minus the amount the buyer actually pays for it. Now, consumer surplus measures the benefit buyers receive from participating in the market. In this example, Taylor receives a $20 benefit from participating in the auction because she pays only $80 for a good she values at $100. Now, Carrie, Rihanna, and Gaga get no consumer surplus from participating in the auction because they left without the album and without paying anything. Now, consider a somewhat different example. Suppose that you had two identical Elvis Presley albums to sell. Again, you auction them off to the four possible buyers. To keep things simple, we assume that both albums are to be sold for the same price and that no one is interested in buying more than one album. Therefore, the price rises until two buyers are left. In this case, the bidding stops when Taylor and Carrie bid $70 or slightly higher. At this price, Taylor and Carrie are much happy to buy an album, and Rihanna and Gaga are not willing to bid any higher. Taylor and Carrie each receive consumer surplus willingness to equal to her willingness to pay minus the price. Taylor's consumer surplus is 30 and Carrie's is $10. Taylor's consumer surplus is higher than how the previous example because she gets the same album but pays less for it. The total consumer surplus in the market is $40. Now, using the demand curve to measure consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is closely related to the demand curve for a product. To see how they are related, let's continue our example and consider the demand curve for this rare Elvis Presley album. We begin by using the willingness to pay of the four possible buyers to find the market demand schedule for the album. The table in figure 1 shows the demand schedule that corresponds to table 1. If the price is above $100, the quantity demanded in the market is zero because no buyer is willing to pay that much. If the price is between $80 to $100, the quantity demanded demanded is 1 because Taylor is willing to pay such a high price. If the price is between 70 to 80, the quantity demanded is 2, and we can continue this analysis for other prices as well. In this way, the demand schedule is derived from the willingness to pay for the four possible buyers. The graph in figure 1 shows the demand curve that corresponds to this demand schedule. Note the relationship between height of the demand curve and the buyer's willingness to pay. At any quantity, the price given by the demand curve shows the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer, the buyer who would leave the market first if the price were any higher. At a quantity of 4 albums, for instance, the demand curve has a height of $50, the price that Gaga is willing to pay for an album. We are on page number 136 of the book right now. At a quantity of 3 albums, the demand curve has a height of $70, the price that Rihanna, who is now the marginal buyer, is willing to pay. Now, because the demand curve reflects buyers' willingness to pay, we can also use it to measure consumer surplus. Figure 2 uses the demand curve to compute consumer surplus in our 2 examples. In panel A, the price is $80 or slightly above and the quantity demanded is 1. Note that the area above the price and below the demand curve equals $20, and this amount is exactly the consumer surplus we computed earlier when only one album is sold. Panel B of figure 2 shows consumer surplus when the price is $70 or slightly above. In this case, the area above the price and below the demand curve equals to the total area of the 2 rectangles. Now, Taylor's consumer surplus at this price is $30 and carries is $10. This area equals to total of $40. Once again, this amount is the consumer surplus we computed earlier. Now, how a lower price raises consumer surplus? Because buyers always want to pay less for the goods they buy, a lower price makes buyers of a good better off. But how much does buyers' well-being rise in response to a lower price? We can use the concept of consumer surplus to answer this question precisely. Now we are on page number 137. Figure 3 shows a typical demand curve. You may notice that this curve gradually slopes downward instead of taking discrete steps as in the previous 2 figures. In a market with any buyers, the resulting steps from each buyer dropping out or are so small that they form a smooth curve. Although this curve has a different shape, the ideas we have just developed still apply. Consumer surplus is the area above the price and below the demand curve. In panel, consumer surplus at a price of P1 is the area of triangle ABC. Now suppose that the price falls from P1 to P2 as shown in panel B, the consumer surplus now equals area ADF, and the increase in consumer surplus attributable to the lower price is the area BCFT. This increase in consumer surplus is composed of 2 parts. First, those buyers who were already buying Q1 of the good at the higher price P1 are better off because now they pay less, and the increase in consumer surplus of existing buyers in the reduction is the amount they pay. It equals the area of the rectangle BCED. Second, some new buyers enters the market because they are willing to buy the good at a lower price. As a result, the quantity demanded in the market increases from Q1 to Q2, and the consumer surplus these newcomers receive is the area of the triangle CEF. Now, what does consumer surplus measure? Our goal in developing the concept of consumer surplus is to make judgments about the desirability of market outcomes. Now that you have seen what consumer surplus is, let's consider whether it is a good measure of economic well-being. Imagine that you are a policymaker trying to design a good economic system. Would you care about the amount of consumer surplus? Now we are on page number 138. Consumer surplus, the amount that buyers are willing to pay for a good minus the amount they actually pay for it, measures the benefit that buyers receive from a good as the buyers themselves perceive it. Thus, consumer surplus is a good measure of economic well-being if policymakers want to satisfy the preferences of buyers. In some circumstances, policymakers might choose to disregard consumer surplus because they do not respect the preferences that drive buyer behavior. For example, drug addicts are willing to pay a higher price for heroin, yet it would not say that addicts get a larger benefit from being able to buy heroin at a low price, even though addicts might say they do. From the standpoint of society, willingness to pay in this instance is not a good measure for the buyer's benefit, and consumer surplus is not a good measure for economic well-being because addicts are not looking after their own best interests. In most markets, however, consumer surplus does reflect economic well-being. Economists normally assume that buyers are rational when they make decisions, and rational people do the best they can achieve their objectives given their opportunities. And economists also normally assume that people's preferences should be respected. In this case, consumers are the best judges of how much benefit they receive from the goods they buy. Now we are on page number 139, producer surplus. We now turn to the other side of the market and consider the benefits sellers receive from participating in a market. As you will see, our analysis of sellers' welfare is similar to our analysis of buyers' welfare. Now, cost in the willingness to sell. Imagine now that you are a homeowner and want to get your house painted. You turn to four sellers of painting services: Vincent, Claude, Pablo, and Andy. Each painter is willing to do for the work for you if the price is right. You decide to take bids from the four painters and auction off the job to the painter who will decide the lowest price. Now, each painter is willing to take the job if the price he would receive exceeds his cost of doing the work. Here, the term cost should be interpreted as the painter's opportunity cost. It includes the painter's out of pocket expenses for paint, brushes, and so on, as well as the value that the painters place on their own time. Now, table 2 shows each painter's cost. Now, because a painter's cost is the lowest he would accept for his work, cost is a measure of his willingness to sell his services. Now, each painter would be eager to sell his services at a price greater than his cost and would refuse to sell his services at a price less than his cost. At a price exactly equal to his cost, he would be indifferent about selling his services. He would be equally happy getting the job or using his time and energy for another purpose. Now, when you take bids from the painters, the price might start high, but it quickly falls as the painters compete for the job. Once Andy said $600 or slightly less, he is the sole remaining bidder. Andy is happy to do the job for 500. Vincent, Claude, and Pablo are unwilling to do so from less than 600. Note that the job goes to the painter who can do the work for at the lowest cost. What benefit does Andy receive from getting the job? Because he is willing to do the work for 500 but gets 600 for doing it, we say that the receives a producer surplus of $100. Now, producer surplus is the amount a seller is paid minus the cost production, and producer surplus measures the benefit sellers receive from participating in a market. Now, consider a somewhat different example. Suppose that you have two houses that need painting. Again, you auction the jobs to four painters. To keep things simple, let's assume that no painter is able to paint both houses and that you will pay the same amount to paint each house. Therefore, the price falls until two painters are left, and in this case, the bidding stops when Andy and Pablo offer for $800. Now, Andy and Pablo are willing to do their work at the price, while Vincent and Claude are not willing to bid a lower price. At a price of $800, Andy receives producer surplus of $300 and Pablo receives of $200. The total producer surplus in this market is $500. We are on page number 140 right now. Now, using the supply curve to measure producer surplus, just as consumer surplus is closely related to the demand curve, producer surplus is closely related to the supply curve. To see how, let's continue with our example. We begin by using the cost of four printers, the supply schedule that corresponds to the cost in table 2. If the price is below 500, none of the four painters is willing to do the job, so the quantity supplied is 0. If the price is between 500 and 600, only Andy is willing to do, and the quantity supplied is 1. If price is between 600 to 800, Andy and Pablo are willing to do the job, so the quantity is 2, and so on. Now, the graph figure 4 shows the supply curve that corresponds to this supply schedule. Now, note that the height of the supply curve is related to the seller's cost. At any quantity, the price given by the supply curves show the cost of the marginal seller and the seller who would leave the market first if the price were any lower. At a quantity of 4 houses, for instance, the supply curve has a height of $900. The cost that Vincent, the marginal seller, incurs to provide his painting services. At a quantity of 3 houses, the supply curve has a height of $800, the cost that Claude, who is now the marginal seller, incurs. Now we are on page number 141. Now, panel B of figure 5 shows producer surplus at a price of $800. In this case, the area below the price and above the supply curve equals the total area of two rectangles. Now, this area equals $500. The producer surplus we computed earlier for Pablo and Andy when two houses needed painting. The lesson from this example applies to all supply curves. The area below the price and above the supply curve measures the producer surplus in a market. The logic is straightforward. The height of the supply curve measures seller's cost, and the difference between the price and the cost of production in each seller producer surplus. Thus, the total area is the sum of the producer surplus of all sellers. Now, how a higher price raises producer surplus? You will not be surprised to hear that sellers always want to receive a higher price for the goods they sell. But how much does sellers' well-being rise in responsible to a higher price? The concept of producer surplus offers a precise answer to this question. Figure 6 shows a typical upward sloping supply curve that would rise in a market with many sellers. Although this supply curve differs in shape from the previous figure, we measure producer surplus in the same way. Now, producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve. In panel A, the price is P1 and producer surplus is the area of triangle ABC. Now, panel B shows that happens when the price rises from P1 to P2. Producer surplus now equals near ADF. This increase in producer surplus has two parts. First, those sellers who are already selling Q1 of the good at the lower price P1 are better off because they now get more of what they sell. The increase in producer surplus for existing sellers equals the area of the rectangle BCAD. Now, second, some new sellers enter the market because they are willing to produce the good at the higher price, resulting in an increase in the quantity supplied from Q1 to Q2, and the producer surplus of these newcomers in the area of the triangle CEF. Now, market efficiency. Consumer surplus and producer surplus are the basic tools that economists use to study the welfare of buyers and sellers in a market. These tools can help us address a fundamental economic question: is the allocation of resources determined by free markets desirable? Now we are on page number 143. To evaluate the benevolent social planner. To evaluate market outcomes, we introduce into our analysis a new hypothetical character called the benevolent social planner. The benevolent social planner is an all-knowing, all-powerful, well-intentioned dictator. The planner wants to maximize the economic well-being of everyone in society. What should be his planner do? Now, should she just believe buyers and sellers at the equilibrium that they reach naturally on their own, or can she increase economic well-being by altering the market outcome in some way? Now, to answer this question, the planner must first decide how to measure the economic well-being of a society. One possible measure is the sum of consumer and producer surplus, which we call total surplus. Now, consumer surplus is the benefit that buyers receive from participating in a market, and producer is that sellers receive. It is therefore natural to use total surplus as a measure of society's economic well-being. To better understand this measure of economic well-being, recall how we measure consumer and producer surplus. We define consumer surplus as consumer surplus is equal to value to buyers minus amount paid by buyers. Producer is amount received by sellers minus cost to sellers. Total is the addition of all. The amount paid by buyers equals the amount received by sellers. So the middle two terms in this expression cancel each other. As a result, we can write total surplus is equals to value to buyers minus cost to sellers. Now, total surplus in a market is the total value to buyers of the goods as measured by their willingness to pay minus the total cost of sellers of providing those goods. If an allocation of resources maximizes total surplus, we may say that the allocation exhibits efficiency. If an allocation is not efficient, then some of the potential gains from trade among buyers and sellers are not being realized. For example, an allocation is inefficient if a good is not being produced by the sellers with lowest cost. In this case, moving production from a high cost producer to a low cost producer will lower the total cost of sellers and raise total surplus. Similarly, an allocation is inefficient if a good is not being consumed by the buyers who value it most highly. In this case, moving consumption of the good from a buyer with the lowest valuation to a buyer with a high valuation will raise total surplus. Now, we are on page number 144, evaluating the market equilibrium. Now, figure 7 shows consumer and producer surplus when a market reaches the equilibrium of supply and demand. Recall that consumer surplus equals area above the price and under the demand curve, and producer surplus equals the area below the price and above the supply curve. Thus, the total area between the supply and demand curves up to the point of equilibrium represents the total surplus in this market. Is this equilibrium allocation of resources efficient? That is, does it maximize total surplus? To answer this question, recall that when a market is in equilibrium, the price determines which buyers and sellers participate in the market. Those buyers who value the good more than the price represented by the segment AE on the demand curve choose to buy the good. Buyers who value it less than the price do not. Now, similarly, those sellers whose costs are less than the price represented by the segment CE on the supply curve choose to produce and sell the good. Sellers whose costs are greater than the price represented by the segment ED do not. Now, these observations lead to two insights about market outcomes. Free markets allocate the supply of goods to the buyers who value them most highly as measured their willingness to pay. And second, the free markets allocate the demand for goods to the sellers who can produce them at the lowest cost. Now we are on page number 145. Thus, given the quantity produced and sold in market equilibrium, the social planner cannot increase economic well being by changing the allocation of consumption among buyers or the allocation of production among sellers. But can the social planner raise total economic well being by increasing or decreasing the quantity of the good? The answer is no. As stated in this third insight about market outcomes, that is, free markets produce the quantity of goods that maximizes the sum of consumer and produce a surplus. Now, together, these three insights tell us the market outcome makes the sum of consumer and producer surplus as large as it can be. In other words, the equilibrium outcome is an efficient allocation of resources. The benevolent social planner can therefore leave the market outcome just as she finds it. This policy of leaving well enough alone goes by the French expression laissez faire, which literally translates to leave to do, but is more broadly interpreted as let people do as they will. Now we are on page number 146. Here it is in the news. There is a box named the invisible hand can park your car. In many cities, finding an available parking spot on the street seems about as likely as winning the lottery. But if local governments relied more on the price system, they might be able to achieve a more efficient allocation of this scarce resource. Now, society is lucky that the planner doesn't need to intervene, although it has been a useful exercise imagining what an all knowing, all powerful, well intentioned dictator would do. Let's face it, such characters are hard to come by. Dictators are rarely benevolent, and even if we found someone so virtuous, she would lack crucial information. Suppose a planner tried to choose an efficient allocation of resources on her own instead of relying on market forces. To do so, she would need to know the value of a particular good to very potential consumer in the market and the cost for every potential producer. As she would need this information not only for this market but for every one of the many thousands of markets in the economy, the task is practically impossible, which explains why centrally planned economies never work very well. The planner's job becomes easy, however, once she takes on a partner, Adam Smith's invisible hand of the marketplace. The invisible hand takes all the information about buyers and sellers into account and guides everyone in the market to the best outcome as judged by the standard of economic efficiency. It is truly remarkable feat, and that is why economists so often advocate free markets as the best way to organize economic activity. Now we begin with page number 147. So it says, should there be a market for organs? Some years ago, the front page of the Boston Globe ran the headline, How a Mother's Love Helped Save Two Lives. The newspaper told the story of Susan Stephens, a woman whose son needed a kidney transplant. When the doctor learned that the mother's kidney was not compatible, he proposed a novel solution. If Stephens donated one of her kidneys to a stranger, her son would move to the top of the kidney waiting list. The mother accepted the deal, and soon two patients had the transplants they were waiting for. The ingenuity of the doctor's proposal and the nobility of her mother's act cannot be doubted, but the story raises some intriguing questions. If the mother could trade a kidney for a kidney, would the hospital allow her to trade a kidney for an expensive experimental cancer treatment that she would not otherwise afford? Should she allowed to exchange her kidney for free tuition to her son at the hospital's medical school? Should she be able to sell her kidney and use the cash to trade in her old Chevy for a new Lexus? As a leader of public policy, our society makes it illegal for people to sell their organs. In essence, in the market for organs, the government has imposed a price ceiling of zero. Now we are on page number 148. The result, as with any binding price ceiling, is a shortage of the good. The deal in the Stephens case did not fall under this prohibition because of no cash changed hands. Many economists believe that there would be a large benefit for allowing a free market for organs. People are born with two kidneys, but they usually need only one. Meanwhile, some people suffer from illness that leave them without any working kidney. Despite the obvious gains from the trade, the current situation is dire. The typical patient has to wait several years for a kidney transplant, and every year thousands of people die because a compatible kidney cannot be found. If those needing a kidney were allowed to buy one from those who have two, the price would rise to balance supply and demand. Now, sellers would be better off with the extra cash in their pockets, and buyers would be better off with the organ they need to save their lives. The shortage of kidneys would disappear. Now, conclusion, market efficiency and market failure. This chapter introduced the basic tools of welfare economics, consumer and producer surplus, and used them to evaluate the efficiency of free markets. We showed that the forces of supply and demand allocate resources efficiently. That is, even though each buyer and seller in a market is concerned only about her own welfare, together they are guided by an invisible hand to an equilibrium that maximizes the total benefits of buyers and sellers. A word of warning is in order. To conclude that markets are efficient, we made several assumptions about how markets work. When these assumptions do not hold, our conclusion that the market equilibrium is efficient may no longer be true. First, our analysis assumed that markets are perfectly competitive. In actual economics, however, competition is sometimes far from perfect. In some markets, a single buyer or seller may be able to control market prices. This ability to influence prices is called market power. Market power can also cause markets to be inefficient because it keeps the price and quantity away from the levels determined by the equilibrium of supply and demand. Second, an analysis assumed that the outcome in a market matters only to the buyers and sellers who participate in the market, yet sometimes the decisions of the buyers and sellers affect people who are not participants in the market at all. Now we are on page number 149. Pollution is a classic example. The use of agricultural pesticides, for instance, affects not only the manufacturers who make them and the farmers who use, but also many others who breathe the air or drink the water contaminated by these pesticides. Now, market power and externalities are examples of general phenomenon called market failure, the inability of some unregulated markets to allocate resources efficiently. When markets fail, public policy can potentially remedy the problem and increase economic efficiency. Microeconomists devote much effort to studying when market failures are likely and how they are best corrected. As you can continue your study of economics, you will see that the tools of welfare economics developed here are readily adapted to the endeavor. Now, despite the possibility of market failure, the invisible hand of the marketplace is extraordinarily important. In many markets, the assumptions we made in this chapter work well, and the conclusion of market efficiency applies directly. Moreover, we can use an analysis of welfare economists and market efficiency to shed light on the effects of various government policies. And in the next two chapters, we apply the tools we have just developed to study two important policy issues: the welfare effects of taxation and the international trade. Now, there is a chapter quick quiz. First question is that Jen values her time at $60 an hour. She spends 2 hours giving Colleen a massage. Colleen was willing to pay as much as $300 for the massage, but they negotiate to a price of $200. In this transaction, first option is consumer surplus is $20 larger than producer. B, consumer surplus is $40 larger than producer. C, producer surplus is $20 larger than consumer, or producer surplus is $40 larger than consumer surplus. Second question, the demand curve for cookies is downward sloping. When the price of cookies is $2, the quantity demanded is 100. If the price rises to 3, what happens to the consumer surplus? First, it falls by less than 100. Second, it falls by more than 100. Third, it rises by less than 100. And fourth, it rises by more than 100. Now, third, John has been working as a tutor for $300 a semester. When the university raises the prices, it pays tutors to $400. Now, Jasmine enters the market and begins tutoring as well. How much does producer surplus rise as a default of this price increase? First, less than 100. Second, between $100 and $200. Third, between $200 and $300. And fourth, by more than $300. Fourth question says an efficient allocation of resources maximizes first consumer surplus, second producer surplus, third consumer surplus plus producer surplus, and fourth option is consumer surplus minus producer surplus. Fifth question is when a market is in equilibrium, the buyers are those with the dash willingness to pay and the sellers are those with the dash costs. A is highest, B is highest lowest, C is lowest highest, and D is lowest lowest. Now, sixth question is producing a quantity larger than the equilibrium of supply and demand is inefficient because the marginal buyer's willingness to pay is A negative, B 0, C positive but less than the marginal seller's cost, and D positive and greater than the marginal seller's cost. So with this we end the chapter, that is chapter number 7.